It was a dark, rainy night when Sarah and her younger brother, Liam, moved into their new home. The house was old, too old some might say, but it was affordable, and with their parents away on business, it was all they could afford. The house was secluded, surrounded by trees, with only one narrow road leading to it. They were alone. As they began unpacking, Sarah noticed the eerie silence that hung in the air. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of distant traffic. It was as if the world itself had forgotten this place. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Sarah froze, unsure of who could be visiting at this hour. Opening it cautiously, she was greeted by an elderly woman, her face wrinkled and pale, with deep, dark eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," the woman said, her voice raspy. "I'm Mrs. Hawthorne. I live just down the road." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Hawthorne leaned in closer. "Be careful at night. Not everyone is who they seem around here." And just like that, the woman turned and disappeared into the shadows
The first
of the
few
night.
days were quiet, almost too quiet. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At night, Sarah could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath her bed, but when she looked, no one was there. Liam had been acting strange. He would stare at the corner of his room, his eyes wide, as though he was watching something, or someone. "There's a man in the wall," he would whisper, his voice trembling. "Don't be silly," Sarah would tell him, but the fear in his eyes was real. Then one night, as she lay in bed, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She could feel it. Someone was watching her. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. Turning to her side, she could just make out the faint outline of a figure standing at the foot of her bed, its form shadowed by the dim light of the moon outside. She gasped, but when she reached for the lamp, the figure was gone.
It wasn't just Liam who had begun to hear things. Sarah, too, started to hear soft whispers at night, just barely audible at first, but growing louder as the nights passed. One evening, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She went down to the basement, hoping the sounds would stop if she could just find their source. As she descended the rickety stairs, her flashlight flickered and sputtered. The basement was cold and damp, the smell of mildew thick in the air. In the far corner of the room, a patch of the wall seemed different. Sarah approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She pressed her hand against the stone, and to her shock, it moved. A secret door. She opened it and stepped into a narrow hallway, leading to a hidden room. The whispers grew louder now, almost frantic. In the center of the room was an old, rusted metal chair, its straps frayed and broken. And on the walls, scratched into the stone, were symbols, dark, twisted, incomprehensible symbols. The floor was covered in dust, but the air was thick with something else, something ancient. And then she saw it. A name, carved into the wood of the chair, Hawthorne. The next day, Sarah went to the old woman's house, her heart racing with dread. Mrs. Hawthorne's warning echoed in her mind. Not everyone is who they seem around here. The house, though closer than Sarah remembered, seemed far older now, dilapidated, almost decaying. She knocked, and Mrs. Hawthorne answered immediately. "Ah, you're back. I thought you might be," the woman said, her smile wide, but her eyes hollow. "I knew you'd find it." Sarah swallowed hard. "What is this place? What's happening here?" Mrs. Hawthorne sighed deeply, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "This house, this land, it was built upon something ancient, and it feeds on fear, on souls. Every family that moves in, the house calls to them." Sarah's blood ran cold. You knew this would happen?" "I knew," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice dark with regret. "But it's too late now. Your family is part of it. You can't escape it. The house, it has already claimed you." Just then, a low, rumbling growl came from deep within the house. The walls began to shake, the floorboards creaking, groaning under some immense weight. As the night fell, Sarah and Liam tried to escape. The house felt alive, shifting, breathing. It wasn't just a house. It was something worse. The walls whispered their names, calling them back. The air grew colder with each step they took. They ran through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. But no matter how fast they moved, they couldn't seem to leave. The front door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Suddenly, the shadow at the foot of Sarah's bed returned. But this time, it was no longer a figure. It was a mass of twisting, writhing darkness. The whispers turned into screams, and from the blackness, a shape began to form. A tall, gaunt figure with pale, bloodshot eyes. It was Mrs. Hawthorne, and she wasn't alone. Behind her, countless other figures, twisted, tortured souls, emerged from the shadows, their faces contorted in pain and terror. "The house," Sarah whispered in horror. "It's alive." "Yes," Mrs. Hawthorne's voice echoed, now a low, menacing growl. "And tonight it feasts." And with that, the house devoured them. The house stood silent once more, the whispers fading into the night. Only the wind remained, carrying the screams of the lost souls to the darkness beyond.